Welcome to this morning's program, Existential Challenge, Haredim and the State of Israel. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this call. My name is Hai Kempler, a member of the Israel Action Committee of Temple Emmanuel, and I'm moderating today's program. Our speaker, Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, will talk for about 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Please post your questions on the chat and I will relay them to him. I'm delighted to introduce Rabbi Pfeffer, a distinguished member of the Haredi community in Israel. I invited him to talk to us about a subject that is critical to the future of the state of Israel and the Haredi community, which comprises about 13% of Israel's population right now. He is passionate about the essential contribution their unique Torah learning and values make to the well-being of the state, while mindful of their obligation to the larger society. Haredim have insisted on separation from the state. He will discuss what that has meant and how it must be changed. Now, a word about Rabbi Pfeffer himself. He was raised in England and made Aliyah to Israel at the age of 17. He served as a law clerk to a Supreme Court justice and as a Dayan in the religious court system. He is currently the head of the Haredi division of the Tikva Fund, a lecturer in law at Hebrew University, a member of the law faculty and Department of Social Work, and a founding editor of Haredi publication called Tzarech Iyun. Currently, he resides with his wife and 8 children in Jerusalem, where he is a rabbi of Kehilat Or Chadash, a flourishing and growing Anglo community. Rabbi Pfeffer.
Well, thank you, Hyman. That sounds like a very impressive biography, so I appreciate that. And good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And I will, like Hyman said, I will do my best to squeeze in a brief presentation in 30 minutes, in half an hour. 15 minutes would be really quite untenable, but we'll do half an hour and then we'll do questions. And I'm very happy to do questions and answers. And please feel free, meaning I'll try to touch on some basic points that I feel are integral, crucial, central to the question of Haredi society and the state of Israel. I would add Haredi society and the Jewish people. It's not just about the state of Israel. As we know, in the US and in other places around the world, those who call themselves, in a broad sense, Haredim, which is again a very loose term and can include many different types of sub-communities. Maybe we'll speak about that later too, but certainly they're on the rise numerically and also in terms of their ability to wield political and social influence. So it's relevant for the whole world. But for the state of Israel, it's not just relevant, it's also existential. For the state of Israel, this is not the US, where whether Haredim go to work or not, or participate in civic duties or not, is not going to be the factor that, the make or break factor for the future of the US. But for Israel, it is very much an integral, a key factor for the future of Israel. So I'm going to, as I said, speak for a short time with your permission, uninterrupted. But then I think, sometimes the most interesting parts of these sessions is the questions and answers, questions from people who care, who have their own connections, who have their own grievances sometimes or interests. And I'm definitely very happy. And please be candid, be frank. I've developed thick skin here, so it's quite all right. I'm happy to address any questions that might be raised. So let me begin. And Caitlin, I will try to share a screen. Let's see if this works. Good. Do you see the screen? You should. Let me make sure that it's good. I think this way is the best. So,
yep, we're all set.
So what you see on the screen here is Haredi demonstration. And a demonstration it is, meaning it's a demonstration of numbers, a demonstration of power in a certain sense. This is from 2014, and it was quite a moment for myself because it was actually a demonstration that was related to the Supreme Court, issues of draft into the army of the Haredi population, which have plagued Israeli politics for many years already and continue to do so today. Just this week, there was a bill in the Knesset that was not passed, that was supposed to have been passed, but didn't pass. They'll try again in a couple of weeks concerning the draft for Haredim. So this was a demonstration, and a picture can sometimes be more powerful than many words. What we see here is not just strength in numbers, but also the ability to galvanize, to mobilize such a tremendous number of people for the joint cause, for the communal cause. Naturally, there are many different communities within Haredi society. Hasidim and the Litvish sectors have not always gotten along well together, and there continue to be internal tensions between them, not to speak of multiple internal tensions between Hasidic groups and Litvish groups and the Sephardi, the Eastern groups. So there's plenty of sub-communities. And nonetheless, when they have a joint interest that's strong enough to bring them together, particularly in areas of political concerns vis-a-vis the state of Israel, general society, and so on, so they're really able to do so. I have a personal story over here because specifically in 2014, I was actually interning at the Supreme Court, would you believe? And we had this demonstration outside the building of these, masses and masses of, thousands upon thousands of Haredim. So obviously, all of us went out to see what it's all about. And, being outside there, I had this kind of conflict of interest. On the one hand, being a part of Haredi society in Israel, while on the other, being an intern at the time at the Supreme Court of Israel. So that's just for the anecdote. I very much hope you're able to pick me out from the crowd over there in the picture. Now, I've mentioned this as the Haredi opportunity, and I think it is. One could frame it otherwise, as the Haredi challenge, and that would be an absolutely true framing also. But concomitant, together with the fact that there is a big challenge of Haredi society, I also like to see it as a tremendous opportunity for Israel. And in the few minutes I have, I'd like to present both of those angles again, very briefly. And maybe Caitlin, give me a signal when I have like 5 minutes left or something. I'm not going to be looking at my watch, so you'll signal me, okay? Thank you. So first of all, let's speak about the magnitude of the challenge, and the challenge it is. This is okay. This is the different groups within Haredi society. We'll skip them. You'll take my word for it that there are many different groups within Haredi society. Okay, this is a population count. I think we have here's a more graphic representation of this. So over here, as you see, we have, this is the yellow is the Jewish population of Israel, not including Haredim. The pink or brown pink is the Arab population of Israel. And the blue is the Haredi population of Israel, which has been growing tremendously and continues to grow at a very fast rate. If you notice, hey, these are projections. So the projections through 2035, 2040, those are still reasonably accurate projections. We know how to project population growth within a span, of, let's say, 20 years. If we're going to be thinking about, 2060, 2065, those projections are more speculation than projection, because a lot can change within 40 years. The classification of who is Haredi, the classification of what's going on in Israeli society and so on, a lot of things can change naturally. But still, even looking at 2040, over here, we're speaking about 20% of the population of Israel. Today, we're at approximately 12 or 13% of the population of Israel. And if we look at the schools, the school age population of Israel, the Haredi school system has approximately 25% of the Jewish population, which is a tremendous force. It's a lot. Just thinking about the population, the Haredi population in Israel today. So even though the absolute population of Haredim is something like 1.3 million, this is by self-definition. But the interesting factor to bear in mind is that something like 60% of that number is below the age of 19. And that's unbelievable. Meaning for the general population in Israel, that number is something like 30% under 19, which is also very nice. Israel has very impressive childbirth rates. These are the childbirth rates, fertility of Jewish women. And as you see, very nice rates, no question. Israel has, this is for Jews who define themselves as being Chiloni or secular, 2.2, very impressive and rising. Traditional, 3.1, which is more or less the Arab birth rate also. It's also approximately 3 or 3.1. It's also the Israeli average, more or less. This is the religious Zionist, but way up there is the Haredi birth rate. And by the way, these graphs are not entirely accurate. The Haredi birth rate updated today has dropped a little bit from 7 and is now something like 6.8, but it's still very high. It's very high in absolute terms. We have 8 children and we're just an average Haredi family. I promise you, nothing to write home about. But this is, I even have another graph over here. This is Israel's birth rate, just to indicate Israel has a wonderful birth rate relative to other OECD countries. Just for your benefit, I've put the US over here. US is something like 1.8, and Israel is all the way up there on 3.1. And the 2 countries beneath Israel are not what you would really be able to describe as liberal democracies, Mexico and Turkey. So Israel is really way up there in terms of, free democracies. And this is not because of Haredim. Haredim, they contribute their share, but it's because of Israelis in general. And I think it's something which is to be admired and very special. But nonetheless, it's if you look at the Haredi birth rates, they're way up there. And therefore, there's no question that Haredim are a force to be reckoned with. They're a force to be reckoned with today, and they're certainly a force to be reckoned with for the future. That's the first point I think it's important to make. Now, often, the greatest challenge which is highlighted by the Israeli media or by Israeli society, broadly speaking, is the economic challenge. And this certainly is something worth highlighting. It's worth mentioning. And if we look at the next graph over here, this is employment rate. So, skip all of these. This one is the interesting one. This is the non-Haredi Jewish employment rate, something like 90% of men. And the Haredi employment rate is something like 50%. It's even gone down below 53. It's something like 51% now, or 50%, which is very low. Even among those who are employed within Haredi society, the level of income of Haredi men and Haredi women's employment rate is pretty close to the non-Haredi employment rate of women. This is for all those who believe that Haredi society is an ultra-conservative society. In some ways, we are ultra-conservative, but find me any other society in the world which is considered ultra-conservative, in which women are the main breadwinners to a far greater degree than men. So it's a complicated story. The ultra-conservatism of Haredi society does not necessarily tally with that of the Christian fundamentalists, or with the Amish, or with the indigenous Indians, or whoever it might be. We have our own brand of conservatism, and I'm happy to expand on that later on if there'll be demand. But for the moment, let me just mention the economic challenge. So close to 50% of men being employed at all, right? The others are not unemployed. Unemployment refers to someone who's seeking employment but is unable to find employment. Haredim don't work, but it's not because they're unemployed. It's because they don't want to work. It's because they want to stay in full-time Torah study. On the one hand, this is something very beautiful, right? To appreciate and to place study of Torah at the height of your ladder of values is something which I find very beautiful. On the other hand, there's no question that it poses a deep economic challenge. And this is a quick representation of income. So look at this, it's amazing, right? This is men's income. So a Haredi man, even if he's working, right? And we know about him, okay? He's working and he's working on the books, and he's making a fraction, close to half, a little bit more than half of the non-Haredi Jew in Israel. And this makes a very big difference, because Israel, for Israel, economic prosperity is not a bonus. It's not a nice to have. Israel spends the highest percentage of its GDP on military expenditure of any country in the OECD by far. And there's a good reason for it, because we're surrounded by hostile enemy countries. We need a strong military, and alongside a strong military, we also need health services, we also need education, we also need infrastructures, just like every other country in the world. And therefore, for Israel, economic growth is a big deal. It's highly meaningful. And one of the main engines of economic growth is Haredi society. Or I should rephrase that. One of the great potential engines for economic growth is Haredi society if they will enter into highly paid and high-level employment in Israel. Many of these Haredi men are no slouches. They know how to study, they're bright individuals, they can do a whole range of impressive and productive labor. And that could be a great engine of economic growth. If they choose not to do that, then this could be a tremendous source of economic drain on Israel's economy, right? It's either one way or the other. And therefore, the question of Haredi employment is a big deal. Look at poverty rates. These are poverty rates in Israel. Again, what are poverty rates? So poverty rates, important to mention, are not absolute poverty, right? Absolute poverty is measured in terms of, I don't know, $2 income per, I don't remember exactly how much the universal measure for poverty is, but this is relative poverty. But even if we speak about relative poverty, which is the accepted measure of poverty among OECD countries, so this is, again, the green is non-Haredi Jewish families, individuals, children. Okay, we're speaking about very low percentages living in relative poverty. And look at the Haredi numbers. 50% of families, 60 of individuals, close to 70 of Haredi children living in relative poverty. Does that mean that Haredim have a hard life and a hard time? Not necessarily. You learn how to live with less. And again, one can see this in a very positive and even admirable way, that Haredim want to live a more modest existence. They value study and achievement in Torah more than they do fancy cars and fancy homes. They are prepared to sacrifice their vacation in Europe and elsewhere, and having a car and having a nice home and so on, for the values that they believe in. But before we get to the question of judging, right, and maybe we don't want to be judgmental, or maybe we do, happy to discuss later on, but let's just speak about the challenge. This is clearly an important economic challenge for the state of Israel. And this starts with education, obviously. The Haredi education system is not geared towards producing the next Albert Einstein or the next, Elon Musk or whoever it is, right? Elon Musk, excuse me. The educate. I even have a graph of this, right? This is the matriculations Haredi boys. These are the numbers of Haredi boys taking the matriculation exams. This is not even passing them. This is just taking them, which is very slight. The girls do a bit more. And generally speaking, the girls have a decent general education because they're expected to go to work. But for the boys, that's very low, and a very, very low number of Haredim have degrees, actually end up getting degrees. So that's the economic challenge. But even though the economic challenge is very important, and I don't want to underplay it at all, but it's certainly not the only challenge. I think that alongside the economic challenge, and like I mentioned, it's also something of an economic opportunity. I think the Haredim, should they make a community-wide decision to enter the workforce and to invest energies there, then they could be a tremendous force for the Israeli workforce. But like I said, economics is not everything. And part of the equation of Haredim in Israel is also the social aspect, the question of Israeli society. As Haredi society continues to grow, continues to thrive, so the question of economic tensions, social tensions within Israel also becomes more prominent and more important, more crucial, specifically today with a government which, again, you can like it or not, but it's a government that certainly is not perceived as being Haredi friendly or religion friendly, and has caused a lot of tensions with the Haredi establishment at the very least, with Haredi politics, and with Haredi person on the street. This causes a lot of social tensions to flare up. One of the major issues, of course, in terms of social tensions is army service. There's civic duties in every country. But if in the United States, maybe your basic civic duty is, I'm not sure, to vote, to pay taxes, or I don't know, there are other civic duties we could speak about. In Israel, there's a very basic civic duty, and that is army service. And it's not a very easy civic duty to discharge. It's a civic duty that requires a tremendous sacrifice from young adults living in Israel. And as we know, Haredim, these are numbers of army service in Israel. These are absolute numbers, so they've risen a bit. But these numbers, right, in 2007, this is before they started the new program for integrating Haredim into the IDF. So the numbers are close to negligible. 290 Haredim serving in the IDF. It's truly negligible. Today, the numbers have risen a little bit. I have to qualify even these numbers by saying that it's a certain sectors within Haredi society. This is not every sector of Haredi society, but only certain sectors. We could go into this later in more detail if you'd like. And also to say that these numbers themselves are not necessarily accurate. They were more than slightly inflated by the IDF in order to meet the government requirements for numbers of Haredim serving in the IDF. And these requirements were established by the Supreme Court. It's a complicated story, but the basic, the basic story of the social aspect over here is what I've written on the side, right? The most burning issue, and I'll just read from this text over here, which I think is from an article of mine about army service on Tzarich Iyun. Tzarich Iyun is the journal that Hyman mentioned at the beginning. Maybe I'll post a link of that later on for your interest. So, and I write as follows: the most burning issue, the arrangement that allows Haredi men to refrain from military service. What moral justification is there for Haredi society to enjoy the protection of the IDF without doing its part for the shared defense? Why should a non-Haredi mother lose sleep over the fate of her uniformed son, while Haredi mothers sleep soundly at night and even take pleasure in their son's presence at the Shabbos and festival tables? And this is a strong moral claim, a moral, a moral demand, which is not being met, and this is not easy for many in general Israeli Jewish society to handle. They look at Haredim as brothers. Haredim are Jews. Haredim enjoy the state of Israel just like everybody else. Haredim enjoy the security that's given by the IDF just like everybody else. So why should they not also participate? And this is a part of the social conundrum or the social tension that we have in Israel. Now, are there answers to this question? There are answers to this question. Are they good answers? We can think about that together if you want. But let me just move on to the third challenge. And that third challenge, I think, is not expressed in social terms, but rather in terms of Israel, Israel as a state, Israel as the political representative of the Jewish people. I think that maybe the deepest challenge, even beyond economics and beyond the social fabric of Israeli society, which is a very big deal, but perhaps the deepest challenge is the question of the future of Israel. Because if Israel is truly to be the political representative as a state of the Jewish people, then it needs to actually represent those Jewish people. And for Israel to represent the Jewish people, Haredim, considering their constant and future growth, will need to be a part of this project. If Haredim won't be a part of the project of the state of Israel, of being a part of its building, its flourishing, its representation, then the state of Israel itself will slowly lose that legitimacy, that place of being the political representative. And this is a big deal in my eyes. I think the question of Haredi belonging within Israel starts, or I don't know if it starts, but at least a central part of it is the Haredi identification with and willingness to participate, willingness to feel a belonging with the state of Israel. These are the challenges that I wanted to lay out briefly: the economic challenge, the social challenge, and the state challenge, this challenge for Israel itself. Now let me dedicate a few minutes just to speak about the opportunity, which is the flip side of the same coin. So in terms of the opportunity, Caitlin, how are we doing for time? Now you're giving me the 5 minutes. All right. So in terms of the opportunity, and I'll do this briefly. So it's important to understand where Haredi society is coming from. What defines being Haredi? What does it even mean? Okay, we've spoken about these numbers. We've spoken about the challenges, but where's this coming from, right? What makes a Haredi guy be Haredi? Wakes up one morning and says, hey, this is what I want to do. Why? What moves him? So, you know, I teach a course at Hebrew U, which relates to Haredi society. And it's much too short, but it's 14 1.5-hour lectures about different aspects of Haredi society. So we don't have that privilege and luxury, and I have 5 minutes. So I'm going to make this very brief. There are many values and many characteristics that define Haredi society. One could speak about the values or the ideologies on the one hand, and one could speak about the sociology on the other hand. The sociology of Haredi society is certainly something fascinating and worth discussing. How they live, the community structure, the gender roles within Haredi society, the questions of what kinds of voluntary work they do, how the chesed in the community functions, and so on. But let me focus for a moment on, and maybe in questions, I'll be happy to speak about those topics, which are very important. But let me speak for a moment or focus on the value system. So Haredim have a number of core values, right? Torah study, for one. I would say a certain inclination to stringency in halachic praxis, meaning to go to a more stringent interpretation of Jewish law. Of course, somewhat ambivalent and depends on which subgroup you belong to, relationship with the state of Israel. But generally speaking, beyond or behind all of these values, I would say that there's one core value that defines Haredi society, and it's a strategy more than a substantive value. And that strategy is a strategy of isolationism. Haredi society is predicated, founded on the idea of being separate, of isolating. What makes Haredi society what it is an understanding that the way in which it can maintain the integrity of Jewish life is by isolating and separating from the caustic elements of modernity, whether as ideas, the ideas of modernity, and those are mainly the liberal ideas of individualism, of autonomy, of what we might, of different aspects of equality and so on. So that's on the ideas section, the liberal ideas that pervade modern society, but also, of course, from the culture, from modern culture and the caustic elements from the Haredi perspective. That means elements of sexual license and promiscuity, again, from the Haredi perspective. That's elements of whether it's the consumer culture that is so dominant in the general culture. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. So the method that Haredi society has espoused in order to deal with these challenges, this dates back to the period of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment in 19th and 20th century Europe. The method that Haredi society espoused to deal with a threat of these winds of change blowing in from the outside was to erect boundaries, to raise fences, to keep out all of these caustic and threatening influences. And that's what also informs all of these other values. Torah study becomes a Torah study that excludes general studies, because general studies make it much easier, facilitate integration. The idea of the leadership, right? Haredi leadership, that's Torah, right? The idea of the leadership being as it is also a leadership that is very much, I would say, isolated, not involved in earthly matters. And that's a part of the isolationist idea, tendency. The concept of having your own education system that doesn't have general studies is what facilitates isolationism. Why do Haredim not? They do, some, many, but many do not participate in the workforce. There are many reasons for that. But one of them is this isolationist tendency. They don't serve in the IDF. Also, the IDF was established by Ben-Gurion both as a mechanism for defending Israel, obviously, but also as a melting pot for Israeli society. And Haredim said, we don't want to be a part of this melting pot. We want to maintain our own identity, which is a separate identity. We don't want to lose our identity, our religious identity, and we don't want it to be superseded by an Israeli identity, which, as it were, gives prominence to the national aspect of being Jewish rather than the religious aspect of being Jewish. We don't want to do that, said Haredi society. And that's why there's this tension with the army, with Israel, with the education system, with general society. Even geographically, Haredim are very much isolated. Now, what's happening today, though, is that there's a certain coming together. There's a certain congruence, a certain motion from both sides, which is bringing more Israeli Haredim and non-Haredim together. And I'll end with this because I know our time is limited. From the Haredi side, the fact of internet exposure and the fact that Haredi society is so big so that there's no choice but to participate in broader society, whether it's in the economic side, whether it's in the side of academic studies, and whether it's just being a belonging to a whole variety of institutions that are shared with non-Haredi society, just brings people together. My own daughters come back from their Haredi schools with their antiquated MP3 players. I don't know if you remember these things, very old kind of, you know, what Haredim have, because the kids don't have smartphones, thank God. So they come back with Israeli artists, Israeli non-Haredi artists, which is something that would have been unthinkable in the past. There's this coming together. And also from the non-Haredi side, if in the past the relationship would have been one of tension, even animosity, today, even the non-Haredi culture is slowly coming to terms and learning about Haredi individuals and Haredi communities in their human sense. Think of different series, television series like Shtisel or like Shababnikim and other television series that portray Haredim just in their human side, without getting into the political conflict, without getting into the argumentation over ideologies and the future of the state of Israel. So there's a certain coming together. Now, that coming together, which we could speak about for a long time, but we're not going to, presents on the one hand a certain threat, a certain challenge to Haredim, because how do you maintain all that's good and pure about Haredi society, the wholesomeness of community life, the fact that kids grow up in an environment that doesn't have smartphones, which for Haredim is key, is your alphabet, it's your building blocks of a healthy society. The fact that you're not growing up with, I don't know, I'm not really up to date with what's going on, but for you know, for argument's sake, you're not growing up with the Justin Biebers of the world and so on. You don't have that culture within the kids' upbringing. That's key to what being Haredi is. How do you balance that with greater integration, with greater participation in Israel? It's not easy. So on the one hand, this is a major challenge that's going to require a lot of work, and that's really some of the work that we're trying to do on Tzarich Iyun and some of the educational programs that I run, is trying to map out how this might look. But it's also, I think, a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity for the Haredim, because being in isolation might give you the benefit of seclusion, might give you the benefit of a kind of Benedictine option of opting out from what's going on in the world. But on the other hand, it denies you the opportunity of shaping what's going on in the world. It denies you the opportunity of making a deep contribution to the state of Israel. And I think that today, certainly in the Hebrew-speaking world, there are some areas of Haredi society in Israel that are still predominantly Yiddish-speaking. And if you speak Yiddish, that's a big contribution to your, you know what, let's stop sharing. If you speak Yiddish, that's a big contribution to your isolation potential. But if you're speaking Hebrew, then over the course of a few generations, you'll become closer to the rest of Israel. You'll start identifying with your host country. And it's not just a host country, it's your country. It's Israel, it's a Jewish state. And the fact of the matter is that the young generation of many Haredim, not all, depends on which groups, but many young Haredim feel a much stronger identification with Israel, and their contribution could be so great, whether it's in terms of family values, whether it's in terms of contributing an important voice, which is sometimes missing from the conversation concerning liberal society and liberal values, whether it's concerning the Jewish nature of the state of Israel, and how should the Jewish the Jewish definition of Israel, how should that be articulated? How should it be expressed? Big question, obviously, but the Haredim should be a part of that also. And this, I believe, is the Haredi opportunity. On the one hand, there are big challenges there, but on the other, I'm strongly I'm a maybe I'm overly optimistic. I like to be consciously optimistic because I think it's healthy. And I'm also a strong believer in the Jewish people, and certainly the state of Israel, which has been a miracle of the modern day. I think the participation of Haredim within the different infrastructures, social, state, economic, you name it, is crucial, is even as the introduction to this lecture said, is existential, and I'm deeply hopeful that this will happen in a healthy way, in a way that won't compromise what it means to be Haredi on the one hand, but on the other hand will enable Haredi society to participate, to contribute, and to be a real part of what it means to be Israeli in the future. So that's it for my monologue, if you want, and now I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Pfeffer. There's a number of questions. Let me start. A very beginning question is, let's see. We are familiar with many texts, Pirkei Avot, which encourage employment in a trade and involvement in the community. What is the Haredi rationale for ignoring this wisdom?
Yes, a very good question. So the rationale for ignoring this wisdom is that even though both in Avot and many other places, the idea of having a trade and earning an income is lauded. In fact, it's a mitzvah, it's an absolute obligation to teach your son a trade. From the Haredi perspective is that the default for today in the conditions that we encounter in the modern age is that if you will, from a young age, engage in going to university, engage in doing whatever it takes to actually earn a trade, to actually be able to do that, then you will be compromising your deepest religious principles. And because of that, so Haredi society is prepared to pay the price, if you want. And I agree with the spirit of the question that this cost, this price, is not always emphasized or emphasized enough within Haredi society, and understandably so, because there's a desire to strengthen the current model in which, generally speaking, boys are funneled into a system of full-time learning. But the reason for that is because of, what does the word Haredi mean? Haredi means to fear, right? To be deeply concerned over something, to be anxious, right? Charada, someone who suffers in modern Hebrew from anxiety is called charada, right? So even though the original word might be from the pasuk, right? Ha-Haredim lidvar Hashem, but the truth is that Haredim are deeply anxious. They're anxious for their kids, they're anxious for their society, and belonging to the general mechanisms by which a person enters into the general workforce is for the Haredi community something which is too dangerous, too threatening to be able to espouse. So even though you're right, there's a real cost to that, and the cost is not being self-sufficient, having to rely sometimes on government stipend. Again, we send our daughters to work, so it's a kind of role reversal. But maybe the attitude is to fulfill the mitzvah by having your girls going to work rather than your boys. It's there are several articles on Tzarich Iyun about the role of the Haredi superwoman, which is not a simple role. But at the same time, this is a cost. And even that, the fact that women go to work rather than men, don't think that doesn't have its own costs and its own consequences. It's not a simple model to preserve. So I hope that's helped a little bit in answering the question. There's also a historical aspect to the question, and that is the connection that Ben Gurion made between working and between army service. And this was, I think it was disingenuous, but whatever it was, it made sense in 1949 when Haredim were just a few hundred families. And the connection at the time was, if you leave yeshiva, then you have to go to the army. And because for Haredim, the army is considered to be a place that is anathema to the Haredi identity and to Haredi way of life. So, as it were, the threat of army service imprisoned, and excuse me for the harsh word, but imprisoned, as it were, Haredim in the yeshiva system. Now that might change because based on new laws, the age might go down, and that's the whole idea of these legal suggestions to lower the age of exemption from the army. It's to allow Haredim to go to work earlier without having this threat of the draft looming over their heads. So that's also the historical component of why Haredim don't go to work.
So here's another question. The true force to be reckoned with is not the Haredim, but their leaders. Intense power is concentrated in a relative handful of rabbis who control vast numbers of the Haredim. Is this not a threat to Israel's democracy?
Well, that's a good question, and that's a question that relates to the leadership model within Haredi society. It's a complex question, which I could definitely speak to at length. Let me just give you a very brief answer to this. Haredi leadership is, on the one hand, rabbinic. It's true, but on the other hand, the rabbis themselves are very, very attuned to the Haredi public, to the people. The decisions, the kind of leadership that Haredi rabbis give is the kind of leadership that the people demand, or the kind of mindset that they hear from the Haredi population. And therefore, on a certain level, you could say, yes, this is not democratic and so on. You know, Haredim they're a state within a state, right? They have their own autonomy and their own leadership. But on the other hand, such a model does not necessarily need to be problematic for a democracy. We know of many communities, think about churches, think about other communities in the US or Israel or wherever. There's community leadership alongside state leadership. And all we need to do is to figure out a good balance of power, a good definition of separation of powers between those two. Sometimes that separation of power has not been effective. For example, in the COVID crisis, where we found that Haredim were following directives, and there was no, by the way, in the COVID crisis in Israel, this was a good example of the lack of leadership rather than leadership. Each sub-community had its own activists, its own rabbinic leaders, and so on. There was no central united leadership, not at all. It was really, it was not a healthy situation in terms of Haredi leadership. But what it also demonstrated was that there's a lack of civic duty, civic belonging to Israel's broader civic society, and the understanding that when you want to fight a pandemic, then it's all for one and one for all. Then you have to be a part of that broader civic society. So, on the one hand, I agree that there needs to be more of an understanding, a separation of powers between the community leadership and between the state belonging to the state of Israel. On the other hand, I don't think that the rabbinic leadership is one of these kind of dictatorial absolute leaderships. It isn't. I once spoke to one of the prominent Haredi rabbinic leader, and we spoke about male employment and the question of why is he not doing more to help men go to work, those men who need to go to work, those men who are not utilizing their time properly. And his basic response was, well, I can't really do anything about it, because if I would, then I would stop, I would cease to be a Haredi leader because it wouldn't be accepted. Meaning he has to be attuned to what the people are expecting. And part of Tzarich Iyun, I'll just, this is, I've sent on the chat a link to the site. Part of Tzarich Iyun is to think about the Haredi mindset, because a lot of the leadership, a lot of the direction in which Haredi society goes is related to how Haredi society thinks, its mindset. If Haredi society will espouse a stronger sense of civic duty, then that will also be represented among the leadership. So it's a partial answer, much more to be said, but out of respect for Hyman here, I'm going to move on to the next question. Yes.
Um, so why can't Haredim serve in non-military public service to the state of Israel? The rabbis of the Talmud had secular jobs. Why can't Haredi men do the same?
Right. So this is a suggestion that has been raised in recent years. In the past there was no such thing, but recently there's been a kind of innovation of civic national duty. They call it shirut leumi, right? Doing your national duty in a way that isn't a participation in the army, but rather as part of dispensing or discharging your civic duties in a different way. And they can. There's no reason why they shouldn't, in theory. In practice, however, it's a very delicate situation. And the reason why it's a delicate situation is that participation in civic duty at the end of the day still means leaving the yeshiva. And because over so many decades, there's become this zero-sum game between yeshiva and army service, so the concept of civic or national duty has become a kind of, well, you're doing your army service, but instead of in the army, you're doing it in some other place. But it still means leaving the yeshiva. It still means departing from the ideal that Haredi society has presented. And, I would say there needs to be more of a moral demand for this to happen from within Haredi society. The Haredi politicians are not interested in promoting this option because it doesn't get them any kind of political gain. They don't gain anything from within the Haredi constituency because there isn't this moral demand from the Haredim themselves. And in terms of the question of Israel's broader political system, well, the other political parties are also afraid of this issue. They don't want to arm wrestle with the Haredim on this issue, and therefore it's very hard to make any kind of progress here. And I think that this is one of the issues that needs to be emphasized and needs to be strengthened. I'll also add, in Israeli society, it's the economic issue sometimes dwarfs the army issue. Armies generally in the world are becoming smarter and somewhat smaller. And the same is true for the Israeli army. That's not to say we don't need boots on the ground. We do. But nonetheless, there isn't a real military need right now for Haredim to be drafted to serve in the IDF. The Haredim are a big headache for the IDF. I'm on the board of Netzach Yehuda, which is an organization that services Haredi soldiers. And it's a big headache. What about women soldiers and Mehadrin food and prayer services and goodness knows what? So it's a headache for the army. The army isn't particularly interested in drafting as many Haredim as possible. In politics, this is a hot potato that nobody really wants to touch. And there isn't a great demand, not from the Haredi side and not even from the non-Haredi side. And that's why this issue hasn't really been pushed. There is such a thing as national duty service for Haredim, but it's never been a very popular option.
Okay. In Shtisel, the brothers regularly refer contemptuously to the Zionists. Is that an accurate depiction of the attitude of older Haredi towards mainstream Israeli society?
Well, in Shababnikim, it's more of a tongue-in-cheek pejorative. It's not really an attitude. It's like, it's more of a kind of joking pejorative for anything that doesn't agree with the Haredi mindset or with the Haredi ideology. It's the Tzionim. It's them. Now, does this represent or does this reflect the popular Haredi opinion? Well, it very much depends. There are some groups that are still what you would call anti-Zionist. Okay, this is Satmar in the United States, and this is groups like Netzarikata, Eda Haredis, many of them, and so on that are anti-Zionist. For a lot of mainstream Haredi society, I would say that anti-Zionism is really a thing of the past. And today it's more of an appreciation that the state of Israel has brought us a lot of good, a lot of benefit, and no few miracles, while at the same time keeping distance from the state of Israel because it remains very secular. It remains very unreflective of the kind of state that Haredim would like to see, and attitudes towards religion, towards religious people, towards Judaism, the way in which the public sphere is conducted and directed and so on, leaves much to be desired from the Haredi perspective. And therefore there's a distance from the state and a distance from the idea of Zionism. But I don't think it would be used as an actual pejorative. It's just used kind of tongue in cheek. And as I mentioned before, for many of the young, excuse me, for many of the young, there's certainly a certain coming closer, even affinity with the state of Israel. You know, Haredi communities, Haredi individuals are not very much exposed to sports. But if they would be, and if Israel would succeed at international sport, which they generally don't, then I think Haredim would be big fans. You know, I have you know, kids in yeshiva. You know, the kids in yeshiva were quite happy when Israel won the Eurovision Song Contest, even though the song that won it was not very yeshivish. But nevertheless, you know, they were happy. Yeah, Israel is on the map. That's a good thing. And you know, when a Haredi Israeli will meet his non-Haredi compatriot while traveling in, I don't know where, in some place in Europe, in Romania or Bulgaria or some other cheap location that Haredim can afford to go to, then they'll be very happy to hear someone speaking in Hebrew. They'll feel a certain camaraderie, a certain coming together with their fellow Israelis, even though this guy is totally secular. So, you know, on the one hand, it's a language, and that language has the word tzionim as a kind of, you know, friendly, joking pejorative, but I don't think it reflects the common attitudes. For some, there is a residual anti-Zionism. For some, there is a kind of distance, a non-Zionist distance. And for some, there's a coming together, a coming closer, and an appreciation that part of our identity is also an Israeli identity, even though it might not be our primary identity.
Rabbi Pfeffer, last week there was a bill that was having to do with the Haredi being drafted, and economic issues, and stipends for children. That was rejected. I saw some of the protests that were being put forth by some Haredim. Arguments like, if you reduce Torah study, it'll be the end of Israel. If you reduce, what you need is more Torah study, and then you'll need fewer people in the army. How central or how mainstream are those arguments?
Right, good question. I would like to hope that this is just nonsensical rhetoric that has no representation within, you know, mainstream Haredi society. Is that true? Not entirely. These arguments are voiced by certain groups and certain individuals, but I think that you know, these arguments are patently ridiculous. You know, if we would have the option of running Israel, would we close down the army and send all the soldiers to study Torah and rely on the miracles of God to protect us from our enemies? That's patently ridiculous, and anyone who would suggest such a thing is clearly employing rhetorical flourishes rather than thinking straight. Now, that just so happened that some people, after so many decades of, you know, clashes and ideological argumentation, they're really not thinking straight, and therefore some people might actually mean this. But I would like to assume that for the average Haredi guy in the street, this has no rational meaning, and certainly would not be espoused as a true argument. What I would say though, and I think this is a deeper point to be made, is that many Haredim actually don't invest very much thought into the question of what would we do if we had to actually run the country. Meaning, let's say tomorrow morning, Haredim get a majority of Knesset votes. So what do? What do they do with the army? What do they do with the economy? What do they do with the foreign ministry? How does the country look? And when I heard Yaakov Litzman, formerly health minister of Israel, I heard him on a radio interview, and he was asked this very question. His answer was, you know what? We'll never be a majority. And the person conducting the interview, he didn't relent. He said, okay, you know what? But theoretically, what would you do? And Litzman said, don't worry, it's not going to happen. We're not going to be a majority. And he's clearly right, because if Haredim would be a majority, they wouldn't be Haredim. They wouldn't be able to espouse this kind of rhetoric, this kind of isolationism, this kind of segregation, because they would be the state. They would have to actually take those basic responsibilities. But the secret that we all need to know is that they need to take these responsibilities. I should say we need to take these responsibilities, not tomorrow, whenever that time comes, when Haredim will be a majority, if that time will come, but rather today, because even as a minority, once you're a significant minority, you need to be able to take those responsibilities. And I think that obligates us in a more mature rhetoric. That's why these kinds of statements, like Hyman expressed before, I find deeply annoying. I'll send on the chat a short article that I wrote about the army issue. This is about internalizing the moral demand, the imperative of army service, which unfortunately I find that many Haredim just don't even think about, and we should be thinking about this.
All right, we're coming to the end. I want to pose one final question.
Sure.
You have expressed what seems like a more moderate, flexible, optimistic view of the future of Haredim society within Israel. How mainstream is your point of view, and where do you think Haredi society is going in general in terms of these more flexible positions?
Well, and again, I'm playing a dual role over here, meaning I'm on the one hand a commentator on what's going on within Haredi society. On the other hand, I'm also an interested player, meaning I'm also involved in a certain sense in trying to lead to Haredi society. Again, Haredi society is changing and molding, irrespective of Yoshua Pfeffer. With all credit to myself, there's a lot of movement within Haredi society, a lot of dynamic that's happening, not because of me and not because of any friends of mine, but just because of tremendous powers, tremendous forces that are acting on Israel and are acting on Haredi society. You can't compare a society of a few hundred families when the state was established to the 1.3 million strong body of today. You can't compare an age in which total isolation was a real possibility, and where all of your information would come from your Ted Ne'eman, meaning from the formal organ of the Haredi political party that you vote for, to the 21st century or 2022, where so many Haredi homes are online and have internet access. So it's a different world. And that different world, almost by definition, inevitably dictates a dynamic. And the only question is which way that dynamic will go. There are a lot of different processes that are unfolding within Haredi society. On the one hand, there's a movement towards greater integration, no question, more participation in the workforce, more people completing degrees within Haredi society, more schools being established that have a decent general education, even for Haredi boys. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have a counter movement, right? A reactionary movement to that, which says 1 minute, if our kids are going to go to academia and participate in a secular workforce, then is that what it means to be Haredi? Is that what our ancestors, our great rabbinic leaders, is that what they fought for? For us to go to academia and to espouse all these values that are creeping into our own society? Surely not. So we have these reactionary movement also. And then you have everyone in the middle, right? Between the more integrating part of Haredi society, let's put them on the left, and the reactionary people on the right. Then you have all the people in the middle who are thinking, well, what about us, right? Where's it going to go? And that's the big question. Where is it going to go? That's where, for example, my own efforts are trying to think hard-headedly about how a Haredi society that on the one hand cherishes those values, those social mechanisms and infrastructures, those basic core elements of what it means to be Haredi on the one hand, but also recognizes our responsibility vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis civic society, vis-a-vis non-Haredim in Israel. And how do we develop a model that can actually bridge between the two? So I'm not trying to create these changes, they're happening anyway, but let's think about how they can happen in the best possible way, because if they happen in a way whereby Haredim who go to academia or the workforce stop being Haredi, meaning they go off the derech or off the Haredi path, then of course the reactionaries will be right, and they'll say, yeah, you can't go that way because it's too dangerous, it's too threatening. And if those are the values being brought into Haredi society, then that will be the end of us. So that, I'm not a prophet. Prophecy was given to others and not to me. So I'm not going to make any bold predictions, but I can certainly say that there's a lot of dynamism in the social sense, in the cultural sense, in the belonging sense, in the question of identity. There's a lot of dynamism, and even if you look at sub-communities, look at the kind of upheavals that are happening, within Ger Hasidus, which is just one example, and other communities, other Haredi communities in Israel. There's a lot of things that are going on that are all somehow related to these big picture items: the question of women, the question of feminism, and a kind of Haredi feminism coming in through these empowered women who are entering the workforce no longer as teachers, but rather as attorneys and as accountants and as high-tech professionals, right? That's on the shidduch market, those have greater cred than your school teachers, right? So, right, but what does that do to a society, right? How does that impact? There's a lot of what we call unforeseen consequences that are just beginning to unfold today, and only time will tell in which way do they unfold, in which way they become unpacked over time within that social struggle, that social space of Haredi society, and the seam between Haredim and between everyone else. And like we opened, and by the way, I'll post a quick article on the Haredi Superwoman. I hope you're getting these links on your chats. Anyway, so thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, informative, and hopeful talk. And I hope it strengthens the notion of Klal Yisrael. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you talk to us this morning. So thanks to you, and thanks to everybody for the questions and staying tuned, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And really a pleasure and a privilege. So all the best to everyone.
Yeah.
And see you all again. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.